And at this point, I want to introduce Her Excellency Anne Anderson, Ireland's permanent representative to the United Nations. Until her appointment in, I think it was 2009, she was Irish Ambassador to France. And her distinguished career in foreign affairs began in the economic division of the department, I believe, and moved through work in several divisions, including our Anglo-Irish, to become permanent representative to the European Union in Brussels, then Irish Ambassador to France, and now Irish permanent representative to the United Nations. And we're delighted and honoured to welcome you here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Well, first, just a few snapshots. On the 9th of October, a masked man boarded a school bus in the Swat Valley and shouted at the school children, "Which one of you is Malala? Speak up, otherwise I will shoot you all." Victim identified, he shot the 15-year-old schoolgirl in the head. Malala Yousafzai, the Pakistani activist who defended the right of girls in Swat to go to school, survived the attack, and the Taliban responded by saying that it would make another attempt to kill her. Last August, Lul Alai Osman Barake, a 27-year-old displaced woman living in a camp in Mogadishu, was raped by 5 men in military fatigue. Barake was sentenced to a year in prison for defaming the Somali security forces. The freelance journalist who had interviewed Barake, but had not published the story based on the interview, was also given a 12-month sentence. Both convictions were subsequently quashed. And in January this year, the International Rescue Committee reported that large numbers of Syrian refugees interviewed in Jordan and Lebanon gave fear of sexual violence as a primary reason for their flight. According to the UN, there has now been an exodus of almost 1.2 million refugees from Syria, and 2.5 million are displaced within their own country. Fellow speakers, ladies, gentlemen, I'm honoured and humbled to have been asked to make the address at today's opening seminar. As someone with a profound attachment to the cause of women's rights and women's empowerment, including and specifically in societies affected by crisis and conflict, I have sought throughout my career to work to advance that agenda. Yet, like every one of us here this morning, I stand in awe of the fortitude and steadfastness of women like Malala in Pakistan and Lula Baraka in Somalia, and the thousands and thousands of other women whose stories we never read about in the media, and who every day display a similar bravery in the toughest and most challenging of situations. The gender dimension of conflict, or what we call women, peace and security, was, as we know, first recognised by the UN Security Council in its adoption in 2000 of Resolution 1325. This was subsequently reinforced by a series of further resolutions, 1820, 1888, 1889 and 1960. But 1325 was the watershed moment when the gender dimension of conflict was placed front and centre on the international agenda. And since 2000, women, peace and security has been seen as one of the signal thematic issues before the Security Council. Indeed, 1325 is now so mainstreamed that for those of you with an iPhone, you can download our Women, Peace and Security app that will give you the full range of relevant resolutions and best practice references, as well as the monthly action points that diplomats at the Security Council draw on in their negotiations. But notwithstanding what Apple might have us believe, the world does not shift on its axis with the release of an iPhone app. The bigger challenges still lie ahead of us. We can take satisfaction in having developed the doctrine, but the urgent question now is how do we improve implementation? And that is the issue I want to focus on this morning. How do we close the gap between the high rhetoric and the aspirations contained in Security Council resolutions and the obstinate realities that women grapple with on a daily basis in so many conflict-affected areas? This is obviously a huge question, and I clearly can't hope to cover it comprehensively in a short address this morning. But I want to focus on 4 areas in particular. Number 1, building a compelling evidence-based case showing how 1325 has worked. Some progress has been made in this area. The Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary-General on Conflict-Related Sexual Violence, an office that Ireland has supported financially, is producing reports that are ever more compelling in their range, clarity and detail, including annexes that list and accuse specific parties of having committed rape and sexual violence as a form of warfare. The forthcoming report of the SRSG goes into exhaustive and very difficult detail on the appalling situation of women in different conflict situations, including in Eastern DRC. And that brings, of course, into very clear focus just how challenging a task awaits Mary Robinson, the UN's new Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region. What is surprising, however, given the amount of attention and hard work being done on women, peace and security, is the relative absence of readily available, comprehensive evidence on what has worked and what hasn't, what we should replicate and where we need to try different approaches. One reason for this lack of emphasis on evidence may be reliance on a rights-based approach to women, peace and security, something, of course, that every single person in the room today accepts without a moment's reflection. However, to complement the rights-based approach, we need a compelling, evidence-based, practical case for how women, peace and security works. Such a compelling narrative is all the more urgent given the crowded field in which we are operating and the competing priorities. In peace operations in the field, or in peace agreements in the process of being mediated, women, peace and security is only one among many political and security factors in play. And the truth is, women, peace and security is almost invariably the last box to be ticked in the checklist, the final paragraph in the statement, the point that attracts most skepticism from local male political leaders. We have to move 1325 up the agenda. And part of the answer is to transform the situation of women into a security issue. Hillary Clinton spelled it out very clearly in 2010 when she said, and I quote, "Women's equality is not just a moral issue. It's not just a humanitarian issue. It's not just a fairness issue. It is a security issue." Writing in Foreign Policy magazine last year on her book Sex and World Peace, and drawing on the largest extant database on the status of women in the world today, Professor Valerie Hudson described how she and her colleagues had identified the situation of women as the single best indicator of a country's national and international security. And I quote, "The larger the gender gap between the treatment of men and women in a society, the more likely a country is to be involved in intra- and interstate conflict, to be the first to resort to force in such conflicts, and to resort to higher levels of violence," unquote. Across a range of issues, health, economic growth, corruption, social welfare, family law, the best predictors of insecurity were those that reflected the situation of women. And that is the message we must communicate. The priority for all of us is not to preach to the converted, but to reach to those who have not yet got the message. And one of our most effective tools in doing this is to assemble the facts. Nothing persuades like emphatic empirical evidence. My second point, member states should increase transparency and accountability at the national level. The national action plans that began to be drafted from 2004 onwards were an expression of member states taking more responsibility to better implement Resolution 1325. There are now some 40 national action plans, including 23 in Europe and 11 in Africa. One hopes that the number of action plans will grow. Yet it is striking how little public information is available in assessing implementation of existing plans. I understand that of the 9 national progress reports or assessment reports completed so far, only Estonia's report has been published. What is called for now is a second wave of transparency and accountability. How else can we know whether 1325 is working? What to replicate or what needs to be addressed in a different fashion if the main lessons identified as part of these assessments are not shared? Unlike many national action plans, some of which were undoubtedly written by officials at a desk in their ministry, Ireland's National Action Plan represented a real departure, genuinely fashioned from the voices of women. And it is seen as one of the most inclusive and transparent National Action Plan development processes. It is very important that we should continue transparency, and I hope that at the end of our own progress assessment that is currently underway, we will be ready to share the main lessons identified. In assessing our progress, we will have much that is positive to report. Irish Aid's very extensive support to work on gender equality and combating gender-based violence, through support to 6 partner countries in Africa, nearly 39 national and international CSOs, and leading multilateral entities, including UN Women. Our solid diplomatic work, both at the United Nations and in other multilateral fora. In New York, I and my colleagues at the Permanent Mission are engaged in a whole range of initiatives designed to advance the 1325 agenda. And just to take a few examples of my own involvement, I have repeatedly spoken in Security Council debates on the subject. I worked very hard to ensure that women's participation became part of the peace-building review that I co-facilitated in 2010. And I'm equally determined to ensure that it is integrated in the work on the Millennium Development Goals that I am currently co-facilitating. And it's not just the UN. In our diplomatic efforts elsewhere, we do the same prioritization. During our OSCE chairmanship last year, for example, 1325 was one of our priority areas of work. And we can also, of course, share the work of the Defence Forces, whom I'm glad to see represented here today, who are leaders in the field and are seen to be leaders in the field in implementing 1325 within the framework of peace operations. And it's very welcome that the Defence Forces are producing their own action plan to better implement their commitments under our National Action Plan. These are developments, of course, in which we can take pride. But no more than anywhere else, we in Ireland have not got it all right. The review is bound to show lacunae and areas where we should be advancing faster or in a more focused way. There will be valuable lessons to be learned both from the successes and the shortfalls, and I hope we will grasp the opportunity to demonstrate leadership in publicly sharing those lessons. My third point: maintain the involvement and dynamism of civil society organisations. We all know that civil society has done much of the heavy lifting from the outset, and indeed Resolution 1325 would not have happened without civil society advocacy. And civil society retains a crucial role in amplifying the voices of marginalised women and men and bringing them to bear on decision making, in monitoring the implementation and strengthening the accountability for commitments made by governments, and in maintaining a sense of dynamism, energy and momentum around the women, peace and security agenda. Here at home, the Irish Consortium on Gender-Based Violence is often cited internationally as an innovative and successful model of civil society and government working together towards a shared goal, while the NAP Monitoring Group is also made up of government and civil society representatives and chaired by an independent chairperson, who of course is with us here today. Across so many countries and in every region, there are examples out there of proactive, inclusive, dynamic projects and initiatives being undertaken by women's groups, often with little by way of political or financial support. One could recite dozens and dozens of such initiatives. I recall, for example, at the open debate at the Security Council last November, Michelle Bachelet highlighted the role of women's groups in Mali at that time. And through a gathering of nearly 1,000 women leaders and members of civil society in Bamako, they were aiming to contribute a non-violent solution to the crisis. Although that particular effort failed, the crucial point remains. There is no shortage of women's leadership, but rather a shortage of opportunities for women to move from informal to more formal processes of conflict resolution and peace building. We know how women's voices get lost in that transition. And I look back with a certain sadness and certainly with a great deal of soberness at statements that I made in the course of 2011. At the Commission on the Status of Women in February that year, I spoke about the then unfolding Arab Spring, and I said, in the tidal wave of change that is sweeping through the region, women have been equal partners and equal actors. They have framed the messages, operated the computers and the phones, and taken to the streets with the same passion and fearlessness as men. With the script beginning to be written for the next stage, female voices must continue to resonate equally with male voices. As the transition is made from streets to smoke-filled rooms, there will almost certainly be a temptation to leave women outside. It would be unforgivable if that were to be allowed to happen. Well, that was back in February, and I spoke about the issue again at UN Women in the summer of that year, and again in the Security Council in the autumn, because sure enough, the unforgivable happened. At the Security Council back then, 8 months later, in October 2011, I was speaking about women being increasingly sidelined, as they have been in the Arab Spring. Their courage had helped to make the revolution, but their inexperience of power was allowing others to shape the outcomes. So helping women through that transition from informal to formal processes is enormously complex and challenging, and we need to do what we can at every stage along the way. The starting point is to help support community-based women's organisations, and there is a lot of good work underway that we can build on. Irish Aid, for example, is supporting very innovative work on the ground, and I know our defence forces in southern Lebanon are engaging in important outreach to women's groups. Another important step is to help document and disseminate the individual initiatives that are undertaken in order to transform single experiences into mainstream policy. I co-hosted, for example, a very interesting event at our mission to the UN in New York last November. We learned how the Women's Situation Room, established by Femme Africa Solidarité, successfully mobilised a critical mass of women to monitor, mediate and ensure peace and stability during the presidential elections held in Senegal last year. And it was very encouraging to hear that UN Women and UNDP were working to capture the initiative for adaptation or replication in other situations. As we move along the spectrum from informal to formal processes, we will come to the need for political participation, and I'll address that in a moment. But before that, I feel it would be remiss as we survey the potential for enhancing the impact of civil society initiatives worldwide. It would be remiss not to say a word about the particular challenges facing women's groups in Northern Ireland. I know that these groups have expressed their frustration, including at a recent meeting with Michelle Bachelet in Ivy House, at finding themselves excluded from a full or satisfactory role in either the British or Irish national action plans. We need to be more imaginative in finding ways that, respecting jurisdictional issues, develop the dialogue and bring in from the periphery these women's CSOs. Because ultimately, our credibility in talking of women's participation overseas is linked to our demonstration of women's participation on this island. And to finish this point, it is important to remember that a 1325 National Action Plan is only a means to an end. It should not serve to narrow the agenda, but instead to provide a platform for action. If the framework is too rigid, ignore the framework and seek to make progress outside it. My fourth point, tackle the root cause, exclusion, by boosting political participation. It is becoming increasingly clear at the international level that in order to get more traction with the 1325 agenda, we may need to change the conversation. In order to press ahead successfully on all 4 1325 pillars, we will need to step up our engagement on one of them in particular. The fundamental point about the Women, Peace and Security agenda is that many of the symptoms we are trying to address are manifestations of embedded political structures or socio-economic arrangements or cultural mindsets built on a bedrock of exclusion. Exclusion of women from equal standing before the law, exclusion from fair economic opportunity or equal access to productive resources such as land, and especially exclusion from proportionate political participation. We need to be honest enough, I beg your pardon, before we need to be honest enough, there is something else I wanted to address here. Thank you very much. I seem to, in putting my notes together, I obviously omitted an important page, and I'll come to that. If exclusion is the problem, participation is the answer. The key to unlock lasting progress and impact across all four pillars is participation. In societies emerging from conflict, this must start as early as possible, preferably during the mediation phase, which provides a good opportunity to empower and include women peace builders. Of the 14 peace negotiations co-led by the UN in 2011, only 4 had delegations that included a woman. In the past few weeks, Ireland played a leading role in defending strong language on women, peace and security at the meeting of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. The agreed conclusions urge member states, and I quote, to take effective steps to ensure the equal participation of women and men in all spheres of political life, at all levels of decision making. It was underlined that full participation is essential, I quote, for addressing the structural and underlying causes of conflict, the underlying causes of violence against women and girls. So, if full participation is of such fundamental importance, then it is past time that we devoted significantly more focus and effort to the issue. In the field, we can all see the impact of what are called temporary special measures, in effect quotas, in increasing the number of women election candidates. Of the 9 post-conflict elections held in 2011, only 1, Uganda, employed an electoral gender quota, and it produced a 35% female parliament. In the other 8 countries, women won between 4 and 13% of seats. We all know the tremendous challenges involved, yet change can happen. A good example came from Yemen, where the only single thing the warring factions could agree on was resistance to the idea of including women in their national political dialogue. And yet it is important to remember that in Yemen, as in Somalia, very significant strides are being made on including women politically at the national level. Of 9 peace agreements signed in 2011, only 2, Yemen and Somalia, contain provisions on women, peace and security. Irish Aid is already engaged in some valuable work in Sierra Leone and in Uganda on strengthening women's political participation. The forthcoming review of the White Paper on Irish Aid is nearing completion following a comprehensive consultation process. It is expected to reaffirm our current priorities, including on gender equality and gender-based violence. The review may also point the way forward towards stepped-up engagement on human rights work and on work in fragile states, offering further opportunities to push the participation agenda. We need to be honest enough to acknowledge a complicating factor in all of this. Ireland's credibility in its calls abroad for increased participation by women in decision-making is directly linked to its domestic performance. Currently, we stand 109th out of 190 countries in the global table of women in Parliament. Steps being pursued by the government will undoubtedly improve our performance. So I'm going to conclude here. The main lessons that I draw on 1325 is that we must renew our commitment to closing the gap between ambition and reality. And to this end, as you've heard, I've made 4 proposals. Gathering a more compelling, evidence-based case for why 1325 works, enhance national level transparency and accountability, and in particular share the lessons identified from the progress report on our own national action plan, support civil society's crucial and dynamic role, and most of all, tackle the root cause, exclusion, by putting priority on participation. The stakes are high. Malala Yousafzai recently returned to school, except this time in Birmingham, in England. Following her acquittal, Luli ally Osman Barake warned that women in Somalia who are attacked should take note of her case and remain silent. Her own attackers remain at large. And during the course of today, thousands more vulnerable Syrians will pour into neighbouring countries, 4/5 of them women and children. The world will continue to see innumerable women display incredible fortitude every day, faced with the most extraordinarily difficult conditions. But they should know that they're not alone and that their cause is our cause. Thank you very much.